to colinmarshallradio.com and subscribing to the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list, and especially reviewing the show on iTunes. For some reason, that really seems to help. Thanks. Those of us, and I include myself in this, who don't understand the German language, we have this sense of it as being a lot of tonal sternness and long forbidding compound nouns. But what can you tell us about at least what's something, just any given thing, that those of us who don't read German are missing in German language literature? The strength of German language literature, a strength.
The German language is one of the prettiest languages out there. I think a lot of people who have misconceptions about its sounding a certain way got these ideas from listening to, fake soldiers in war movies. In actuality, it's an extremely lyrical, extremely playful language. And the writers who write in German tend to take advantage of the lightness, the inbuilt lightness of the language for humor. Kafka, for example, he's not an old heavy. He's funny. He's very, very funny in German. And sure, you have long compounds and they can be used very bureaucratically, just like the same sort of language might be used in English, but it can also be used very, very playfully, and often is.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm speaking with Susan Bernofsky, a translator of German literature. She's translated authors like Robert Walser, who is Swiss, authors like Jenny Erpenbeck, who is German, authors like Yoko Tawada, who is Japanese, but all of whom write in German and use, from what I understand, the German language very well indeed. And Robert Walser, who I mentioned first, he is an author who I would say whose time has come. And he's an author you're probably tired of being talked to about, but nonetheless, I want to get a sense of first I'll say this. First I'll say that I became interested in Walser not because of the novels, but because of the Microscripts, which are to this date the most recent translation of his that is out, translated by you from New Directions. And these, for the listener who hasn't seen them, started out as literally very small script, things Walser wrote in 1 to 2 millimeter high pencil writing that I can't even recognize as language. What can you tell us about the Microscripts that I wouldn't necessarily know even from reading them?
Well, when the Microscripts were first discovered as a package of manuscripts after Walser's death in 1956, his legal guardian, who knew him pretty well, thought that they were secret code and not writing at all. You're not the only one who has trouble reading them. But in fact, writing in this way was a method that Walser had developed over the past 10 to 20 years. The exact dating is still under discussion, but to make rough draft writing something less difficult for him in various senses. He'd been experiencing difficulty writing, writer's block, some anxiety connected to writing, also physical cramps in his hands, which he writes about in a couple of letters. And writing in pencil, he says, just freed him up to concentrate on his imagination more. And so the fact that we have these illegible to our eyes documents is just a side effect of this writing process that he developed over time. And usually he would write a story in a microscript form and then copy it over and send the copy out, the fair copy out to a publisher, and often get it printed. But in the course of the 1920s, it became ever more difficult for him to get his ever more experimental work published. And so it happened that he would not necessarily copy over a text that he had written because it seemed to him, fruitless. He wrote an entire novel in that script, The Robber, which he apparently did not bother to copy over, thinking that it was hopeless that he would get it published. It was much too wildly experimental to get printed at the time. And so, we now have a whole mythology around these strange and beautiful manuscripts, which are graphically just astonishing to look at and are written on all sorts of pages, papers, between the lines of postcards he received, on honorarium notices. They're graphically, visually very, very lovely. And we there's a mystique about them. But in fact, their origin is really somewhat quotidian.
And here's the weird thing, or at least it's probably just me being weird, but, I began to hear all these great things, people saying about the novels you had translated, about the Tanners and about The Assistant. And I'd heard you on Michael Silverblatt's show, Bookworm, and Michael's been a guest on this program, and, he loves Walser. And I, for some reason, didn't feel the need to read Walser until the Microscripts, until I saw that he had written these indecipherable to all but specialists, and even then it's quite difficult, scripts on the back on strips of paper, and writing in this bizarre way unique to him. I mean, when I saw that Walser could do that, or was forced to do that, or ultimately did that, or however we want to put it, that made me think, this is a man I have to read. I don't know why I thought that, but knowing that he did these microscripts, I mean, to you, how does that enrich your own conception of who Walser was and what his work is?
Well, it's important to note that we now in our culture are very novel-centric. We focus on novels. We're so novel-centric that we think that a writer who's published a book of short stories maybe isn't a real writer yet until he or she proves himself by producing a novel. And in the early 20th century, well, sure, there already was this novel culture, but there was also a great deal of interest in short prose writing, and every newspaper published every day short fiction, short prose sketches in a section called feuilleton, which, still exists in a lot of European newspapers, just small little sketches, micro stories. And so this is a form that Walser had been writing all his life literarily, and many other writers of his time did as well. The stories got a little nuttier into the 20s as he became more experimental in his style. But his first published book was a book of stories, and the vast majority of his collected works is made up of short prose. In German, he's really understood to have been a master of the short prose form. He wrote novels, but in my opinion, the heart of his artistic production is his short prose.
And what we have in this U.S. edition from New Directions of Microscripts, which is, of course, a subset of all the Microscripts that you have translated here, is that we have a set of short pieces, yes, very short pieces, we might call them. But, I was reading them, and at first I thought, these are going to be short stories. Great, that sounds good. I'm interested in the very short form for fiction. But then I realized, reading them, well, maybe these are diary entries. Some seem like observations. And the more of the Microscripts that I read, the less I knew what they were. All I knew about them was that they were written in this microscript. And that's what I liked about them, is because I could not pin down what they were, because they all seemed to be something somewhat different, and I could never quite get a handle on the percentage truth, percentage fiction, percentage whatever that these were. I mean, is that, I don't want to say intended, but, I found that itself to be a source of richness. Do you find that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's part of the plan. Walser tended not to call the stories stories. Some of them he did, but the vast majority he referred to himself as prose pieces, and he used the German word Prosastück, which literally means prose piece, which is original to him. And it's an amalgam of the story and the essay. And in a sense, I think that one of the reasons that these stories are being so well received right now, a lot of people are really enjoying them. I get emails out of the blue all the time from people who just wanted to write to me because they are loving these Walser stories so much, which is something that never happened. But I think somehow the rise of our blogging culture right now has encouraged the interest in, short essayistic storytelling that maybe was not so much a part of the American cultural sphere 20 years ago.
Reading one of these microscript pieces, that could just be an example of something going on around the narrator in town, I was thinking, well, these will be very easy to read. I'll get these right in no time. But then I found myself reading each individual one over and over and over again because I would get to the end and realized I hadn't grasped it. I couldn't tell you what went on in it. And part of me said, okay, well, what went on in this isn't the point. It eventually became clear that the form was more interesting. But even then, I found myself having to go back and unearth more from each individual, 200-word, 300-word microscript piece. And then I read the novels, The Tanners and the Assistant, right after that, and I found the language surprisingly easy to read. I expected more of this. I don't want to say difficulty, but maybe difficulty is the word. I mean, is there a difference, as much of a difference as I perceive in the prose of the microscripts versus that of, say, the Tanners?
Absolutely. The Tanners and the Assistant and the novel Jakob von Gutten are part of Walser's early work. The microscript texts were written 20 to 25 years later. It's a very different artistic period in his life. And you can see the threads of weirdness already interwoven in the late 19th century modernist, early modernist prose of those early novels. But it's quite a different period in his life, and he shifted gears a lot as a writer.
When I picked up The Tanners, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but is at this moment the most recent of your Walser novel translations. When I picked that up and read it, it was striking how different it really was, because I didn't get to this impression from the microscripts, but I got it very strongly from the Tanners, which was that Walser was very sensitive to, or very aware of, the way life can be wasted. Is that accurate at all to say? Absolutely,
and I think it's also very accurate in the late work as well. If you look at his late novel, The Robber, which is from 1925, it's all about the sense of a life that's been spent perhaps not so fruitfully, and the feeling about that. Walser writes a lot in the 1920s about feeling washed up as a writer and about characters whose lives have sort of come to naught. He's always been, and that's not just autobiographical, he knew he was a great writer, certainly. But he's always, from the beginning on, had an interest in people who were cast out of society or excluded in some way, or not fitting into the patterns of success that are, were standardized even then.
I've heard you talk before about his being Swiss, being sort of an agent of his marginalization. And it's hard to imagine that from the point of view of a 21st century American. I mean, quite frankly, to a lot of the people I talk to about this stuff, they treat German and Swiss like pretty much the same thing. But then I've heard you speak about how his Swiss accent was thought of as just unlistenable, so you couldn't hear him read, and maybe there was some provinciality to his being Swiss. And this is a point I really want to make clear, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, you've translated not just Germans, but as with Walser, Swiss authors, as with Tawada, Japanese, though they all write in German. So what is Swiss about Walser? What is important to your mind about him that is specifically Swiss?
I think that there's a bit of a rebellious streak in him around Swissness in his work, because there was a lot of rejection of the Swiss as provincial from within the German sort of cultural industry, which was very Berlin-centric or Munich-centric, not yet as much Frankfurt-centric as it is now. But certainly Berlin-centric, and to show up with a Swiss accent was to really, really not fit in. And he felt he was treated as a hick. And in writing as well, he was careful to excise as much Swissness as possible out of his early writing. And in his later writing, he'll put it in. He'll use a lot of funny Swiss diminutives, things that, that would never, ever be spoken by a German. For example, the word Prosestück, prose piece that I mentioned before, he refers to them often as Prosestückli, in writing. So little prose pieces, but it's the specifically Swiss form of diminutive diminutive, which he's marking his territory as a cultural outsider with humor, and I find it rebellious in him. He's forcing his German readers to be confronted with Swissness. And there's all sorts of, ways of writing German. Yoko Tawada writes German. She's fluent in German. But she writes a German in which she will underscore the sort of German that a person who's learned the language might write. And that slight alienation in the form of the writing becomes part of the aesthetic of her work.
The slight alienation of Tawada is something that I most certainly want to come back to. I'm going to star that in my notes. But what I want to make sure not to let go of is Walser had the outsideriness of being Swiss, of course, but in every conversation that I've heard or have been involved in about Walser, it always comes back to how poor he was, how obscure he was, or how obscure he became, and how marginal he was or became again, and or how to put this, how we wouldn't have found out about him if not for, a few key elements in his work or in his career. Like Kafka, you mentioned before. Kafka's often talked about as someone we wouldn't be reading except for a few key figures, someone barely saved from oblivion. Is it accurate to say that Walser teetered on the edge of oblivion, that we're lucky to have his work at all today?
Oh, his work was completely forgotten for many years. When he died, he was largely forgotten. It wasn't until the early 1970s, I'd say, that there was a revival of interest in his work, even in Europe, and the interest in this country followed only with a delay after that. Even though the first translations were done as early as 1955 into English by Christopher Middleton, who was a wonderful pioneering translator of his work. But yes, he was very much marginalized, and his work was not commercial enough to get him a prominent literary career, let's say. He was known as a writer. He was a writer's writer. Kafka loved his work. Walter Benjamin loved his work. Musil reviewed Kafka's first book of stories with the remark, "Oh, here's an interesting young writer of the Walser type." So he was certainly known among intellectuals and writers during his lifetime, but especially in the first part of his career, in the first 15 years, say between 1900 and 1915. By 1920, he was sort of drifting into that oblivion, and part of it was just that he's so difficult to read. He's so challenging to read that, a lot of the places that he published, which were largely journals and newspapers, were, editors would shy away from printing him. So he had an ever smaller audience in the 1920s. And if he had been writing the way he was writing 15 years later, even 10, I think he would have had a much wider readership. He was just writing this high modernist prose 15 years too early for there to be an audience for it. He predates James Joyce. He predates Gertrude Stein. But readers who like their work would probably enjoy his as well.
So we can say he became too experimental too early, perhaps. But I think about, again, the early novels. I think about a book like The Tanners, and, reading it, I just imagine to myself, this is a book, too funny and too accessible not to have sort of had its own momentum to move Walser along down its own track. I imagine somebody writing this book, The Tanners, would have then been inexorably sort of shot down the track to literary success because of how entertaining a book it is. So it seems like Walser would have had to have actively refused going down that line. Is that accurate to say about him?
No, he wanted to have more of a novelist career. And after The Tanners, he did go on to publish 2 other novels in rapid succession. The Assistant followed a year after that, and then Jakob von Gunten, which many people consider his finest novel from 1909. I'm not sure exactly why it is that he did not come to write another novel after Jakob von Gunten. I know that he talks about having had a creative crisis in his life around 1910, 1911, and it may be that was the moment when he found himself unable to write another novel, but I think it's something he wanted. And he commented from time to time on the careers of Hermann Hesse and Thomas Mann. He makes fun of both of them. Particularly Hesse. And Hesse is a repeated figure of fun in his poems, later on, satirical poems, as somebody who was, as Walser saw it, Hesse must have been something like a literary bureaucrat, turning out crowd pleasers. Oops, did I say that on the air? Walser's work is of a level of complexity that goes pretty far beyond, the Hesse bestsellers, but the reading public was eating them up. Thomas Mann, is a writer who just an amazing writer, but also was more pleasing to the German intellectual readership with that sort of solemnity of historically and philosophically fraught prose. And Walser is here celebrating lightheartedness and being a little flippant and celebrating playfulness, imagination, and outsiderness. And, it just didn't catch on at that time. And then World War I arrived and, people's minds were probably not on that sort of humor-based entertainment. Entertainment's the wrong word. It's not just entertaining, but it was just not the right work for that age.
If you just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. Today I'm talking to Susan Bernofsky, author, scholar, and translator of such authors as Robert Walser, Jenny Erpenbeck, and Yoko Tawada. If you want to hear the show again after its broadcast, visit either colinmarshallradio.com, the official website of the show, or visit the iTunes store and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. In either place, you'll find the complete Marketplace of Ideas archive, as always, completely free. Questions, comments, feedback of any kind, don't hesitate. Send it to me at Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. It's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Now let's get right back to the conversation with Susan Bernofsky on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Walser may have been, and this sounds odd to say, it almost sounds wrong to say, but he was not deadly serious enough to be popular at that time in that place?
That's my guess. I think if he had paraded his intellectual acumen, which is obvious from his work, with a bit more solemnity, I think that he would have been honored and respected. But everything for him was doubled and tripled and quadrupled with irony. And, so he'll write about characters who are powerful. And by the time he's finished describing someone powerful, you understand that they have less power than anyone else in the universe. and he'll write about, there's a scene in the Tanners where, servant witnesses employer break something. And by the end of the scene, she's completely at his mercy psychologically. He loved those power plays, and he was always pointing out, laughing at, and empathizing with people's struggle with that. And I'm not sure why that wasn't enough to get him a dedicated following of readers, because in fact, if you look at The Assistant, if you look at The Tanners, the psychological wisdom that is apparent in those books, the understanding of family dynamics, the understanding of power relations between employer and employee is really profound. And you would think that would be enough to cement somebody's career, but it just didn't work out that way.
When and where was your first encounter with Walser? I mean, what was it? What were you reading of his that brought him to light to you?
I first read him in 1983 because a teacher assigned his book of selected stories, which Christopher Middleton translated beautifully. And I remember reading that book in New Orleans, where I grew up, sitting in this little back patio of the house we were living in at the time. And I was already trying to learn German at that point. I'd begun learning German, and I remember I had the German of one or two of the stories, and going through, looking at the German, looking at the translation, and trying to figure out how Middleton had gotten from, what in my own haltingly literal, awful translations, had gotten from that to, the sort of majestic, beautiful, lyrical, soaring leaps of prose that he had spun out of it. And so my early education as a translator really began with reading those early translations of Robert Walser by Christopher Middleton. So translating and Walser are all tied up for me, back into ancient history.
I want to get an impression as well of, in a little more detail, how Walser and writers like him, if indeed we can talk about writers like Walser, he seems more distinctive the more we discuss him. How much of a role did they have in the process of you making German your own? I mean, I've had translators on this show before, including John Nathan, who translates Japanese, Suzanne Jill Levine, who translates Spanish, and they all have these stories about how these authors that they love sort of made, consciously or unconsciously to them, internalized the language for them. Do you know what I mean? This sounds so tangled and terrible a question, but do you have a sense of what I'm getting across here?
Yeah, I do. I'd say that my early reading experiences in German in my high school class included works that were so playful. In second year German, I was reading Kafka. A teacher had handed me some Walser. I was reading Walser. I was reading Grimm's fairy tales. And the moment that I knew enough German to be able to read these writers, I was immediately confronted by the enormous playfulness of the German language. And because of the fact that it's a more declined language than English, say, words will change their form a little bit, or the articles, whether they're to reflect whether they're a subject or a direct object or an indirect object. There's more grammatical transformation that happens, and that results in a greater flexibility of syntax. In German, you can play around with putting words in different orders and combining them in different ways and making up new words according to certain fixed patterns, and such that a neologism in German immediately is recognizable as what it is and what it means, because there's an existing pattern for creating words. And that playfulness was just so appealing to me right from the beginning. And so, learning German and learning to translate it was just this whole joyful sphere of learning to play with English. And, since I was a teenager who was planning to grow up and become a novelist myself, I was just very interested in all the things you could do with language, and seeing all the things that could be done in German was just very inspiring to me in terms of thinking about English and what can be done in English, because when you grow up with a language, you tend to take it for granted. But when you learn a language, it's just this huge, miraculous construction that's presented to you with all its capabilities. And in fact, English has all these capabilities too. But we have to figure out how to see them.
Now, we've mentioned earlier Yoko Tawada, one of the other authors that you have translated, who was Japanese born, who writes in German, and who I would have to imagine you feel some kind of intellectual kinship with, because she must have had the process as well, where she discovered German, was able to intellectually learn its capabilities, not just learn them implicitly by growing up with the language, and who then was able to use it in a way that a native German speaker either can't or doesn't. I mean, do you feel any of that, where you're sort of glad to be translating an author for whom German is not the native language for them?
Oh, absolutely. Yoko's interest in language is based on a level of observation that it would be very hard to have in your own native language. You see in her work just a delight that a certain word might mean what it mean what it does and be what it is. And she plays so much with language in her text, which makes it a challenge to translate because she's so often writing explicitly about German words as German. And so sometimes I'll have a German word in the English translation and then write around it, or sometimes I'll make up an English word that's going to sit in its place. But it's a constant challenge to me as a translator. But I'm so attracted to her view of language as something that really defines our existence, defines how we see the world. You know, you really get the sense reading her that having a particular language invites you to see in certain ways, and that, you know, encountering a new one opens your eyes to all other ways of seeing. You know, I think there's somewhere in one of her stories that I translated where a narrator says something about distrusting people who speak their own language fluently. With the sense where if you're really paying attention to language, you're not going to be able to use it fluently because it's just too difficult.
I want to get a sense of what Yoko Tawada is like to read in German, because reading, for example, the book of stories you translated, Where Europe Begins, reading that, I'm a big fan personally of Japanese literature. I have some understanding of Japanese, not enough to read anything in the original, but, you know, Haruki Murakami, a very well-known author, one whose books, I've read all of his books, and I get a certain feeling from his books and from other Japanese novelists like Kobo Abe that I don't get from other nationalities. Now, I wondered if this was maybe the effect of Japanese language and translation, if I was getting that feeling not from authorial intention, but from the way one language becomes another. But reading When Europe Begins, I couldn't stop myself from thinking that this was a translation from Japanese. It felt Japanese to me, and yet I kept saying, no, this was in German. Susan Bernofsky translated this from German. You're going to be interviewing her. She's a German translator. What is going on there? I mean, is this something you're aware of with her writing in German? Does that still have the flavor of Japanese-ness? This is so many abstractions, but it's so overwhelming when I read it.
Okay, so I need to point out, first of all, that half of the book, Where Europe Begins, was translated from the Japanese by Yumi Selden.
Yes, of course.
Who worked with me on that book. But we did sit down together and go through all the translations to achieve something of a unified voice, you know, despite the fact that there were two different translators there.
I get the same feeling from The Naked Eye, if that's any help.
The Naked Eye. Okay, this is a book that was written simultaneously in German and Japanese, which I believe has never before happened in the history of literature. Usually, Yoko Tawada will write a book either in German or in Japanese, but in this case, she sat down and wrote the first chapter in German. And then when she sat down to write the second chapter, it started coming out in Japanese. And so she wrote the chapters in whatever language she felt like writing that day, and then translated the other chapters back and forth until she had two finished manuscripts. And there's somebody in Japan, I believe, is writing a doctoral dissertation on the two manuscripts at this point. And I wish I could read that, but I fear it will be written in Japanese, in which case I cannot. It's interesting that the Japanese writers that you cite, Murakami and Abe, are both very strongly influenced by European literature. You know, I don't think that they're you know, typical of the Japanese canon per se. And Yoko Tawada is also somebody who is very influenced by German literature. She moved to Germany, I think she was 19 or 20, and so became a writer already living in Hamburg studying German literature, you know. And so these are writers who grew, you know, like Murakami and like Abe. I mean, Abe is obviously all, you know, full of Kafka. Tawada is full of Kafka. Murakami is full of American writers, probably also Kafka. And so, you know, it's hard to say exactly what constitutes the Japanese-ness or Germanness of their prose, but I think Yoko Tawada is very conscious of taking material from both cultures and knitting them together, but in such a way that you have a sense of free-floating wonder, because all of these cultural traditions are seen out of their context, i.e. by being put into a collage, become just strange and beautiful, and you really see them like the title story of Where Europe Begins, which is my favorite story in the book. She's knit together Japanese fairy tales, Kyrgyz fairy tales, Russian fairy tales, childhood memory, diary writing, all these different levels of storytelling and cultural reference just tied together into this little floating train ride, which is underlain with that central question of what is Europe?
Now, this gets into the reason that Yoko Tawada struck me as such a fascinating writer in the first place. I mentioned before, Walser started drawing me in when I learned about the microscripts, when I saw these sheets, these scraps filled with incomprehensible miniature pencil writing. I thought, this is a writer I have to read. When I heard that Yoko Tawada went from Japan to write in German and writes in both German and Japanese, and they make these single books, and then I can read them in English translation, I realized I had to read Yoko Tawada. And especially when I heard, I might misquote her, but a quote from her saying, "The interesting lies in the in-between." It made me think of writers like Murakami, who is Japanese but filled with American culture, or a writer like Abe, who is so European-influenced and who also believed that Japanese people couldn't learn English because their brains were the wrong shape or something. Well, he was a weird guy, but
Abe believed that?
He believed that the Japanese brain was physiologically unsuited to learning English.
Oh my God. I love Abe. He's just such a wonderful oddball writer. The Woman in the Dunes, The Boxmen. Yes. These are some of my favorite books ever.
Indeed, I'm glad to hear you like them because, I can bring them all up safely in this conversation. And I can say that all of these writers are in between. And I want to get a sense from you if for you, the in between is where it's at also.
I think the in-between is a great place to actually open your eyes and see something. When you're hovering between two spheres of reference, the very geography of your condition forces you to actually see where you are. I think so much of our everyday lives just is so unmindful and involves not seeing things and not noticing things and not understanding what's around us. And I love literature that puts me in the position of asking me to actually see what it is I do when I speak, when I understand something, when I hear another person, when I think that I'm communicating with another person and hearing them talking to me. I think, being made conscious of these things and of just how miraculous it is that we have languages that we can use to communicate with one another. How great is that? I think there's so much that we take for granted that literature that's written in these in-between spaces invites us to notice and appreciate. For me, there's a lot of joy there.
Now, when you exist and operate in German-speaking settings, when you're in Berlin or wherever, is life made more interesting because you get the in-betweenness of language? It would be interesting for anybody to be there, even someone who's ignorant of German like myself, because it's a different culture and a different place. But do you get an in-betweenness from specifically getting tell me if this is the wrong metaphor, but putting your brain into the German-speaking, German interacting mode and just living that way?
I mean, I think that I enjoy speaking German a lot more than a German might enjoy speaking German. And I enjoy listening to German really just a whole lot. And it's always such a treat. I don't get to Berlin enough these days. Whenever I'm there and have German all around me, it's just a constant pleasure hearing people's accents, the way they speak, those quirky little fun, somewhat snotty, but really affectionate ways Berliners talk. I just love that.
I want to get an idea of German culture beyond the literature and sort of the way you think about it, because that's, I think, going to help some of the stuff I want to ask about literature a little later in this conversation, because, I think of German creators that I enjoy, and I think of no one more so than, say, Werner Herzog, the filmmaker. But where do your interests in German art extend beyond literature? I mean, where do they go? Where do your interests go when you're not thinking about literature, but you are thinking about German things?
Oh, theater. That's easy. The theater tradition in Germany and in Berlin in particular is so extraordinarily well developed and so extraordinarily experimental and interesting compared to the American mainstream. This has to do everything to do with the fact that there is just very, very serious government sponsorship of, cultural institutions in Germany. The government gives a lot more money. The cultural budget of the city of Berlin is much larger than the entire national budget of the NEA, for example. And so, whereas in New York, if you want to go see experimental theater, you're probably not going to Broadway. You're going to go see the Wooster Group or something like that. In Berlin, the theater scene is such that you can go to any one of several major theaters and see directors' theater happening, theater that is done in the Brechtian tradition, in the Heiner Müller tradition, where it's not so much an author's theater as here, which is also a great thing, author's theater, but it's very much in Berlin. It's very much more a director's theater, such that you can have a theater evening that doesn't really even have a play at all behind it. It's really about the production. I love the theater. I blog about the theater whenever I'm in Berlin. I think that's besides literature, that's my number one fascination with the place.
For those just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest today, Susan Bernofsky, author, scholar, translator of Robert Walser, Yoko Tawada, Jenny Erpenbeck, and more. If you want to hear it again, go to colinmarshallradio.com, even though you haven't finished hearing it yet, or the iTunes Store. You'll find the complete online archive, all the interviews of the Marketplace of Ideas there. And if you want to subscribe to the Marketplace of Ideas newsletter, you'll get a weekly update on all things Marketplace of Ideas very easily, very freely, very simply, sometimes funnily, I hope always interestingly. Find the complete details on the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas site. Go to colinmarshallradio.com, that is colinmarshallradio.com. Click the Marketplace of Ideas logo. You'll find the details there. Now back to the conversation with Susan Bernofsky on the Marketplace of Ideas for some more cultural conversation of the depth you demand. That issue of state funding is always interesting for me to think about, because if I hear of a German theater that receives funding from the German public, it doesn't necessarily... I don't think, oh, well, maybe that means they're playing it safe, or maybe that means that they'll be obscure, or that they won't try to get out of the margins. In America, when something gets a lot of public funding, I am often disappointed by the fact that they do play it safe ultimately, or they do stay in the margins. Can I say that doesn't happen in Germany? That when something is funded by some state organization, that it remains as interesting as ever? Do you know what I mean by that? Yeah,
maybe it's because of Germany's unfortunate 20th century history that it's become such a taboo to exercise artistic control over artistic organizations if you're connected to the government. I don't know if that's why it is, but I've seen all sorts of very, very politically critical theater. In fact, that's the dominant tenor. The single largest difference that you would notice from this public funding is that theater tickets in Berlin are relatively cheap compared to here. And so in the United States, going to the theater is something that you can afford if you earn a certain amount. And in Germany, if you can afford to go to the movies, you could probably also afford to go to the theater. And so it's a much more populist sort of setup, and people really do go. People go to the theater for fun. It's a good place to take a date.
And you mentioned the political criticism to be seen in the theater in Germany, and this is also fascinating because in America, yeah, so much political criticism goes on in the theater, but it doesn't really make a difference. I mean, I think the government would rather have you criticize them in a theater in America because they know it's not going to make a difference.
Or in a poem, right?
Yeah, right. It's like, go do it in a theater. No one's going to care. But is there more vitality to that kind of thing in Germany? I mean, is there a sense that it matters more if you do your political criticism in that kind of venue?
I think in general, the arts are more connected with politics in Europe than they are in the United States, period. We tend not to think of literature as political in this country. If something political is happening, you're not going to have, a famous writer called up. It's like, oh, well, the government's decided such and such. Let's see what Philip Roth has to say about it. That doesn't really happen in the United States, but in Germany, you have writers are considered public intellectuals, and you will regularly hear writers, doing op-ed pieces and being asked to weigh in on political matters. It's a different culture. It's a different sense of how the intellectual life of a country, its artistic life, and its political life fit together.
In England, George Orwell wrote about poverty and about sort of strifey type conditions in novels like Keep the Aspidistra Flying and that kind of thing. And he's so considered the political writer of political writers. Robert Walser writes a lot about poverty, but I don't get the political vibe from him. Is he artfully concealing politics from me, or am I right to think that maybe he wasn't political?
I don't know if it's right to say that anyone is not so much political, but I wouldn't put Walser down as a political writer per se. I think he withdrew from those sorts of questions a lot. There's certainly references to political things, like in The Robber, a character comments on the assassination of Walter Rathenau, who was the foreign minister of Germany at the time in 1922. So it's not as if politics never appears, but I don't know. In fact, I haven't really thought about this much, but come to think of it, maybe there's a sense in which he is consciously withdrawing from the political sphere and saying, let me be outside that. Now, he witnessed World War I, which was, the great, massive, traumatic event of the early 20th century in that part of the world where, in Germany, I think there was not a single family that did not have some family member that was, affected by the war. Just the numbers of people that were wounded, injured, killed in that war were just, unprecedented in Europe. And by being in Switzerland at that time, he'd lived in Berlin until a couple of years before the war broke out. But, when the war broke out, he was back in Switzerland. And I think witnessing that from that safe distance must have been strange for him and difficult for him. And in that period of his writing, he withdraws very much from the social sphere in the writing. And so you have a lot of sort of walk stories, very unrealistic fairy tale stories written in that period. I'm not sure how that all fits together.
It wouldn't surprise me if Walser withdrew from the political sphere as from the social sphere, because in everything I read about him, such as it is, I know you're working on a biography of him, so the book, the official book on Walser has yet to come out. It'll probably come from you, but how? It wouldn't surprise me if he withdrew from those two spheres, because he seems to be a man not in withdrawal, but in the process of withdrawing throughout his career. And yet, reading his books, I get the impression so much of a mind engaged that it's so hard to reconcile those two. I can't quite put together the halves of Walser, where he's writing this stuff that seems so, even if it's not of the world, even if it's fantastical, it seems engaged with the world. And yet, he is a man seem to be a caricature of disengagement with it. How do you unite those?
Well, I think that a helpful way to think about it is just thinking about what being a writer meant to him. For him, being a writer was something that you did all the time, full time. He was never one of these people who could have a day job and write. He would take some copying job, some clerical job, and work it until he had enough money to live for a little while, and then quit it and write. And I think that withdrawing into the space of writing maybe went hand in hand with withdrawing from the sort of larger space of social and political interaction. I'm not sure I'm right about that, but to me it makes sense in terms of my feeling about his psychology that having a safe space to take walks, to write about them, to imagine things, kind of implied letting the world rush on without you and finding a place of quiet and stillness.
And there's another dimension of the in-between with Walser that is not linguistic, because, of course, we haven't talked so directly about the years he was working, but he was in a different time. I think of him as being one of the emblematic writers of the transition between the 19th century and the 20th, though I know he is of the 20th primarily. Now, what do you get from, what can you draw from him being of a different time when you're translating, when you're reading, when you're thinking about him? What kind of richness does that offer? Because, of course, when you're translating Yoko Tawada or a living author, you can communicate with them. You can't communicate with Walser, but what is the plus side to his coming from a different era?
Well, he writes a lot about the changing era at that time, that it's foregrounded in his work. And if you look at the story in Microscripts, a sort of Cleopatra, that's a story that I read as being all about the advent of the modern age and what it has done to human beings, namely bad things. It's all a story about being jangled by new technology and the speeded up speediness of modern life. And when he lived in Berlin as a young man, he saw this, tram cars, electrical things, filling the streets all of a sudden, things moving faster than the horse-drawn carts might have moved. And I think that he himself is very conscious in his writing of how the new age is impacting literature as well as society. And so in that story, sort of Cleopatra, he's writing about a woman who feels disengaged from true experience because of all this modernity around her. And then there's this very, very quiet sentence that's written. Every sentence in that story is very long and complicated and jangly. And there's one tiny little sentence in which he's just talked about all the things she longs for. And then he says, often she longed to long for nothing at all, or maybe often she wished to long for nothing at all. Oh, now I can't even remember my own translation. Often she wished to wish for nothing at all. Oh, but in any case, I think that this being on the cusp of an age is imprinted everywhere on his work. And you see it in, The Assistant, which is, set in this very Swiss pastoral location, but the second character, Tobler, the employer of our narrator of our main character, is an inventor. He's all about new technologies and using new technologies, and it brings him nothing but unhappiness and conflict. So I think Walser's transitional point is really important to understanding his work, but I sure wish that I could just get him on the phone and ask him questions when I'm translating his work, because I love so much being able to talk to Jenny Erpenbeck or Yoko Tawada when I'm working on translating them. It's extremely helpful. What was on your mind when you wrote that? I'm just translating a very strange little prose text by Yoko Tawada, who it's going to be presented at a conference in 2 weeks in Philadelphia at University of Pennsylvania. And she sent me a very, very strange little story. It's called, I think, 24. And I just felt I did a rough draft and don't really understand it. So I wrote to her and said, is there something about this text I'm not understanding? And she said, oh, yes, it's based on a Tai Chi sequence.
No.
And, it's like, okay, that is actually extremely useful information for me in completing that translation. Yep. Without it, I would be hard-pressed to turn out a good translation of that piece.
And here's the thing I wonder about translation, especially translation of literature, though, is that when I'm reading a book, no matter what the nationality of the author, I have a richer experience when I don't think that I understand what's going on fully. There's people talk a lot about the modernists and about the great rewards of seeing the patterns underlying the text, or the great rewards of getting the references, getting all the erudite references. But to me, modernism and whatever has come after it, there's always been an exhilaration in the surface of that experimentation. It's never been for me about the things that you have to know to get. It's never been about getting it. These books, whether it's Abe, Murakami, Kafka, whether it's Walser, whether it's Tawada, it's always been about the thrill of just the visceral experience of the text, I guess. And so if it seems like a danger in translation to get an idea of what the text is and then working so closely under that idea that it becomes less ambiguous. I mean, is that ever a threat in your mind, that you might de-ambiguize a text too much?
Sure. The translator is in a different position than the reader in this particular instance. What you're talking about, the modernist tapestry of language that gets laid out, it is, of course, the job of the reader to enjoy the tapestry for what it is and not kind of look at how the threads are connected. As a translator, I am obliged to look for how the threads are connected so that I can, hook them up in the English text as well. But I'm very conscious of trying to produce a final product which does not show the backside of the tapestry rather than the front. And so, I don't get to have that as the first time I read the text, I get to have that experience. But afterwards, I have to look at the text to see, how is this made? How is this effect produced? How is it that the surprise of blah, blah in the sentence is set up earlier in the sentence? What are the mechanics that make this experience, this reading experience possible? So I have to actually go behind the scenes and look at how the thing is constructed. But then it's my aim to set up an English sentence that is not going to explain what happened in the original, but rather produce a similar experience of momentary disorientation, but not so much so that you couldn't figure it out if you decided to try to.
How do you deal psychologically with what seems to me would just be an enormous pressure of being the person who has to, of being the one channel, the single channel through which a lot of people in the huge English language reading world get to know Robert Walser? I mean, you're the one who's putting the thing that is Robert Walser in front of them. What you write is Walser to them. How do you not crumple under the pressure of that, I guess is what I'm asking, because I wouldn't be able to handle it.
Oh, now you're frightening me. My goodness. I have such responsibility. I've never thought about it. This is terrible.
Yes.
I'm surely misrepresenting him awfully. I deal with it by not worrying so much about the responsibility of standing for a voice, because worrying about that will in no way contribute to producing texts in English that have any quality. I try to instead enjoy the make-believe and play acting part of the process. It's fun to pretend to be somebody else. As a writer, I can write my own work and I can write other people's work. I can write several other people's work, a large number of other people's work. And, doing all the voices is just very, very fun. And, I try and connect with that side of the activity as opposed to the responsibility and inevitable failure of responsibility that, might be on the other side of that equation, because I just don't think it would be helpful.
And of course, you can always say to yourself, well, if the readers really want to get unadulterated Walser, they can learn German themselves. They can put in some decades. They can go to the German. I'm not damaging anything here.
Oh, yes, that's right. I want everyone to learn German anyway. It's a fabulous language. You can play with it in ways that are just not available to us in English. I mean, English has its own great playful ways, but the German ways are just so much fun. If you learn German, you'll see what I mean.
I've been speaking with Susan Bernofsky, translator of such German language authors as Jenny Erpenbeck, Yoko Tawada, and of course Robert Walser. The newest translation from him is Microscripts. Susan, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
If you'd like to find out more about Susan Bernofsky and her work, visit Susan Bernofsky, that is BERNOFSKY.com. This has been The Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. If you want to hear this show again, visit colinmarshallradio.com, where you'll find the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, or go to iTunes. Search on the iTunes store for The Marketplace of Ideas. They're all there as well. Ben Althouse makes our theme music. Find his website at benalthouse.com. And if you have questions, comments, feedback, or any kind of guest suggestion, send that along to Colin, COLIN, at colinmarshallradio.com. That's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. And there is also a weekly Marketplace of Ideas mailing list giving you updates on all things MOI. Sign up for that very simply on the front page of colinmarshallradio.com. Well, the front, after you click the Marketplace of Ideas logo. That's the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list, sign-upable at colinmarshallradio.com. Thanks for tuning in as usual. Be sure to catch us next time for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand on the Marketplace of Ideas.